Fabulous. So yeah, welcome everybody, and thank you so much for joining for our last session of the term. And it promises to be a really interesting one. We're thrilled to welcome Jurgena Kamberaj from ETH Zurich, where she is a senior researcher in the Risk and Resilience team at the Center for Security Studies. And Jurgena is actually offering us a slightly different kind of format to what we're used to, and she is providing a debrief of the Global Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction, which took place just 1 month ago in Geneva. So Jurgena was actually a member of the Swiss delegation and also co-chaired several different sessions at the Global Platform. So she was able to offer us really an extremely valuable insider insight into what was going on in some of those discussions. So we're thrilled to have you, Jurgena, and I think I'll go ahead and pass over to you for your presentation. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Ainsley, very much for organizing this session, and also to those participating here. As mentioned just a few seconds ago, I would like to reflect on some of the global discussions on disaster risk reduction that took place at the Global Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction, organized by the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, at the beginning of June in Geneva. And here I'll share how I and some of my colleagues actually who were present experienced those discussions and what might be relevant or maybe also thought-provoking to those of us working or researching in DRR. And whenever I give a presentation or a lecture, I usually try to get a sense of who is in the room. And this is because I like to tailor what I say to what might interest you most. But of course, that's not so easy to do online. But I still ask you to think of this session maybe as a shared space, not just as a presentation to consume, but a chance to co-reflect, to bring in your own experience. Maybe you could tell me if you had the similar insights as the ones that I have, and also raise questions or doubts as well. Let me share the presentation, and I will quickly walk through to what I will be talking. Yeah. Wait. Perfect. Do you see my presentation? Okay. I will.
Sorry, Jurgena, I think you actually might be muted now.
Wait a second.
Okay, we hear you now.
Okay. Now, do you hear me? Yeah.
We hear you, yeah.
Okay, perfect. So I'll begin with a short introduction about myself, the work that I do, and the institutions I'm part of. I will hopefully give you more context as to why I attended the global platform and the perspectives that I bring. From there, I will move on to the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction and the global platform itself, with the Sendai Framework as the underlying structure that links it all. Rather than going through official outcomes, which you can all read, they are official and public. I will try to then focus on what we actually observed, some of the key policy debates, the shifts in DRR that have emerged in these past years, and wherever possible, I'll try to link these global conversations to the national and the local level, so that ideas don't stay actually in the abstract space. I will particularly share some of the reflection on how DRR is perceived or occurs in Switzerland, which is the country where I'm based. So yeah, who am I? I'm both a researcher and a practitioner. I like to describe myself as a pra-academic, someone whose work bridges academic research and practical hands-on experience in crisis and disaster management. As Ainsley mentioned, I am a senior researcher at the Center for Security Studies, but while my focus of research is Switzerland, I bring in a lot of international and field-based experience. Previously, I worked at the European Commission Crisis Management Unit and was involved in several disaster response until the Turkey, Syria earthquakes of 2013. So often in the office, you might see me like this, but in other times, even with a different uniform, I also look like this, as I serve as a firefighter in my local fire brigade. So in many ways, I bridged the two worlds. Ashley, you're taking care of this, right?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So I try to bridge the two words, which is one, the research, and then the operational, the analytical, and the practical one. Mm, what we do at the Center for Security Studies, which is based at the ETH, actually, we do hold national mandate from the Swiss federal government, the Federal Council, to conduct independent research and provide policy advice on key security issues. Our center covers a broad spectrum of topics, from military strategy and cyber defense to risk and societal resilience in the face of emergencies and disasters. And within our risk and resilience team, my work focuses on a fundamental question. So how can we or as part of societies, be better prepared for and respond to emergencies and disasters? And to do that, we work on two different levels. Operationally, we collaborate closely with local and regional authorities in civil protection and crisis management, looking at how the system works in practice, but we also look at the strategic level. So we maintain a dialogue with the federal institutions, especially with the Federal Office for Civil Protection, because we are aware that civil protection, emergency management, also called worldwide, is not just as a technical or operational entity, but is a matter of national security. And because of that, in my team, we are both researchers and practitioners, and we act as translators between what is happening globally and how it applies locally. We are also part of the Swiss delegation to the global platform, a role we take on in close coordination with the Federal Office for Civil Protection. And in this role, we don't just observe, but we actively contribute by bringing in critical perspectives and really advocating for science-based policy. And this year at the Global Platform, I was involved in several other activities. I first coordinated session TS1, development and adoption of technologies to accelerate disaster risk reduction. I also took part in internal meetings and exchanges and organized one of the official field visits that took place at the end of the event. I don't know if someone or someone that participated in this field visit is here today. So I engaged both at the global platform, both as a part of the Swiss delegation, but as well as an active user, contributing in my role as a researcher. So I was both participating in the discussions, but also absorbing a bit those type of debates. Now let's turn into the global platform for disaster risk reduction, or shortly GP 2025. This event was organized by UNDRR, and it is the main global forum for shaping disaster risk policy. It happens every 2 years and brings together thousands of actors from governments and UN agencies to civil society, academia, and the private sector. To give you a quick sense of the scale, over 3,000 participants came in person from 166 countries. Nearly 600 joined online. 45 of the in-person participants identified as women, 58 people identified as persons with disabilities, and finally 96 young people were included in national delegations and helped shape a bit the agenda. But what is the broader context in which this global platform took place? I think this is very relevant to understand the current debate. So how did we actually get here? And we're now 10 years into the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. It is important to also mention that this framework, which was adopted in 2015, it is not a legally binding treaty. That means that it does not impose obligations on states. Instead, it offers guiding principles and goals, maybe a shared direction for countries to reduce disaster risk and disaster loss. So it is the result of nearly 3 years of negotiations, and it builds on Ohio framework for action, which came before it. And the Haigo framework was adopted in 2005. And it was really the first serious attempt to bring disaster risk reduction to the top of the global agenda. It was ratified shortly after the 2004 earthquake and tsunami triggered in Southeast Asia. I think everyone remembers this event. And this event was somehow the catalyzer that brought disaster risk reduction into the global talks. But the Haigo framework had 3 major shortcomings anyways. First, the local level disaster management was largely ignored, even though that's where most of the disasters are managed in practice. Then it focused almost exclusively on natural hazards, overlooking man-made and cascading risks, for instance. And finally, it really lacked a mechanism to track or assess progress. And since there was no instrument equivalent to evaluate how countries were doing. Against this backdrop, the Sendai Framework emerged, and it was adopted actually a few years after the earthquake. Earthquake and tsunami occurred in Sendai in Japan. This event in 2011 caused over 15,000 fatalities and widespread destruction. And at the same time, while the talks were occurring in Sendai, so the disaster talks were occurring in Sendai, a tropical cyclone in Vanuatu was developing, and during the conference itself, and this really gave a bit the urgency and the visibility to the negotiations. But let's also not forget that 2015 was a milestone year for multilateralism, because we saw the launch of the Sustainable Development Goals, the Paris Agreement, and there was a bit of sense of optimism and a momentum that I believe that disasters could be reduced and the development could be risk informed. So this is a bit what was the stage for the starting of the Sendai Framework. This optimism was also rooted a bit in the logic of accountability, because if we have global goals and measurable indicators, we can then later track progress, identify who is falling behind, and hold government actually accountable. But of course, as we will see later, this approach has actually also limitations. Yeah, we will discuss about this point maybe later. Now let's look at the decade that followed. I'm showing you this slide not just as a timeline, but also as a reminder, as our memory, including mine, tends to fade, and we often forget the scale, the frequency, and impact of recent events. And actually, these are just a collection of several disasters that occurred in this last decade. And I realized that these are all events where I was operative in disaster response during my work. So it was also an exercise for me to refresh my memory and understand, okay, I was active in that disaster, and that happened, etc. But yeah, I would also like you to understand that while so many events occurred, from wildfires to extensive floods, or even the COVID pandemic, sometimes I also forget about this. Some of these events actually triggered major reforms in crisis response, and this was the case, for instance, with the Har Valley flood in Germany. And this timeline also shows a bit that risk is not decreasing, but is deepening, and it's diversifying. And the pace of disasters continues maybe to escalate and exacerbate humanitarian needs, especially in fragile and conflict affected context. So yeah, here we are 10 years into Sendai with just 5 years to go. And the global platform in 2025 served a bit as a checkpoint, a moment to take stock and course correct for the final stretch. Yes, there has been progress. One is that global mortality has been reduced down by nearly half over the past 25 years, contributing to target A of Sendai. The number of countries with national and local DRR strategies has doubled, and the number of countries with multi-hazard early warning systems has increased by 25% since 2019. But the mood has also shifted because while Sendai started with an excitement and a sense of collective momentum, I believe, and that I think everyone can sense and feel that the atmosphere today is more cautious and even skeptical, because we're living in a time of fragmentation in multilateral governance, raising nationalism and inward-looking politics, and in many cases, a shrinking humanitarian space with the UN structures and programs being downsized and dismantled. But yet, I think with this context, the disaster community was doing or did something both very simple and also radical and bold, in my impression, because it is still coming together in person in Geneva. And the over 30,000 participants that I showed before came together not only to sell or showcase best practices, but really to speak openly and sometimes also uncomfortably about the risk that we face and how we might still reduce them. So let's look at some of the outcomes of the global platform and how they might shape the last 5 years of the Sendai Framework, or even what comes after. There was a lot that happened at the GP 2025. So to make sense of it, I've grouped the main results into 5 broader thematics: risk, inclusiveness, financing, and technology. These 4 aspects came up again and again throughout the sessions, and in many ways, I believe they reflect where the global DRR conversation is heading next. Let's begin with the first, risk. And from many of the conversations I had during the global platform, it became clear that the final phase of Sendai Framework is returning to its original mission from 2016, which is putting risk understanding back at the center of disaster risk reduction. That means more than just identifying hazards. It's about understanding how risk evolve, how they intersect, and how they cascade across sectors and systems. Many speakers, I heard this a lot, use terms like systematic risk and polycrisis. And I think Katie Peters also mentioned this in her blog, and she shared the link with us. I think so. I believe that systematic risk and polycrises were mentioned quite often in speeches and debates because there is a global realization that multiple risks can actualize at once, and they affect entire systems from local to national to global levels. And that's why, in my view, one of the priorities for the next 5 years and for any post-Sendai agenda is simply this, that it's important to keep risk discussions on the table. This also means making disaster risk reduction a priority for other UN organizations and not only UNDRR. It requires commitment from institutions such as UNDP, UN OCHA, UNEP. I also personally often struggle to understand where the boundaries are in terms of competences, funding, etc. So it would be very important to actually, when possible, to connect the DRR dots with climate policy, development planning, and humanitarian response. And right now, these agendas from these various institutions are often separate. But some people like Margareta Wallström, she is a UN representative. So some individuals, they suggest that in the future we might see one merged global policy framework. This could look like a single risk-based architecture that connects climate, disaster development, and sustainability, though I'm not very sure how achievable this could be or would be. Then another concern that I heard and I share is that risk is still often framed as something we can control if only we had the right tools. And there is a deep belief in dashboards, models, early warning systems, and now obviously increasingly AI solutions. And these are certainly powerful tools, but they also risk reducing complex and social realities to manageable indicators. I will link this aspect when I talk about the technology component, the technology part of the presentation. And finally, in many of the sessions I joined, it became clear that understanding risk not only matters, so it only matters actually if it is translated into local realities. And this was the key message from the Swiss federal minister at the platform. International platforms are important, but they cannot replace national and local responsibilities. The message is that global frameworks provide direction, yes, but local authorities are the ones who act. And unless risk understanding reaches the people who make decisions on the ground, then nothing changes. But I do see this already happening, and let me show you a concrete example how. At the global platform, the UNDRR launched the updated set of hazard information profiles. This document contains structured, concise descriptions of specific hazards. Each profile is around 2 to 4 pages long and summarizes what we know, how this hazard behaves, and how they can lead to disasters if not managed properly. And just a side note here, this is also why the UNDRR insists that there is no such thing as natural hazards. And I do read this nowadays less, but in some publications where the terminology natural hazard is constantly repeated. So there is not such thing as natural hazards, and disasters are not natural, but they are the result of unmanaged risk. Anyways, these hazard profiles are important for the global community because they build up a common language across countries, sectors, and organizations, and they serve as a quick reference tools for risk assessment, DRR strategies, and emergency planning. You might be wondering, how does this global tool play out in actual disaster management? I took as a concrete example drought in Switzerland. In the hazard information profiles, drought is categorized as a meteorological and hydrological hazard, part of the precipitation related cluster. Switzerland's Federal Office for Civil Protection uses this classification to build a national hazard catalog, which identifies relevant risks across different regions. This national hazard catalog is regularly updated to reflect the constantly evolving hazard landscape. But then this information is passed on to the cantonal level, and the cantons are the federal entities of Switzerland. In this case, I took as an example the canton of Bern, which then conducts its own regional risk analysis to understand how drought actually might impact the canton's territory specifically. From there, it reaches the municipal level because each municipality is assigned a risk level. And in this case, if the risk is high, so the orange color here, the municipality is required to develop a drought emergency plan. And this plan defines not only who does what, in the event of drought warning, which local authority activates which measure, how water use is restricted, how communication is handled, And I really like this example because it shows how global risk tools like the hazard information profiles are not just abstract ones, but indeed they can become very powerful when they are translated into national policies, regional strategies, and then local action plans. Because understanding risk is the first step, but it only matters ultimately if it is translated to the local actors. Then I proceed with the second core theme that emerged at the global platform, inclusiveness. This is really one of the core pillars of the Sendai Framework, and also it's central to UNDRR's mission, because under the motto "disasters do not discriminate," inclusiveness means that gender, age, disability, and cultural perspectives should be integrated into all policies and practices. Back in 2015, when the Sendai Framework was adopted, this was seen as groundbreaking step, and I mean this was just 10 years ago. It set a new benchmark for inclusive disaster risk reduction, and now, nearly 10 years later, several practitioners, including myself, have noticed that inclusiveness is also translated into practice. It is not perfect, but inclusiveness and stakeholder engagement have increased as measured by the Sendai Framework Gender Action Plan. In many places, inclusiveness has become mainstreamed, and not only into national policies, but also into how we train, plan, and respond. And I'll come back to this with a concrete example later. But I also want to mention that inclusiveness means as well who gets to speak and who gets heard. And I mentioned earlier the example of Vanuatu and Tropical Cyclone Pam, and how global platforms like this one are among the few spaces, global spaces actually, where small island developing states can express concerns, gain visibility and urgency. And in one of the sessions actually that I joined on DRR and SIDS, what struck me was really how concrete and urgent the contributions of these nations were, because unlike many other discussions where I was present, these discussions stay actually quite abstract, but the voices from small island developing states were very grounded, because they are already living the risk that many other countries are still preparing for. So at the same time, I also could not help but notice how limited the high-level presence from European or North American countries was. And yes, the European Commissioner for Crisis Management attended briefly, and as did the Swiss Foreign Minister, but otherwise, Global North was not strongly represented. And I strongly believe that if we want to inclusive disaster governance, anyone, then everyone needs to show up. So structural inclusion requires the participation of all actors, in my opinion, in true Swiss direct democracy style. And I believe this step is really necessary, because otherwise inclusion becomes inclusiveness, sorry, it tends to become symbolic, only symbolic. And the platform, yes, featured many youth, indigenous, and women-led initiatives, but so they were also celebrated and quoted. But I'm not sure, and I don't know if they were shaping decisions, if they were in the room where budgets were cut or discussed, and where priorities were set. So I really think we need to ask ourselves if we are empowering communities or we are simply showcasing them. I also want to share a bit a concrete example of what inclusiveness looks in practice. And in this case, the inclusion, I'm talking about the inclusion of people with disabilities in how we train, plan, and respond to disasters. Last October, I participated in a large-scale exercise which brought together many European civil protection teams for a complex cross-border scenario. And one of the defining elements of this exercise was the active integration of people with disabilities, including those with physical, sensory, and cognitive impairments, into really all stages of disaster response. The key question of this exercise was really, how do emergency teams communicate with and evacuate then people with disabilities in a safe and effective way? So now you might think that this aspect is quite standard. That of course exercises include these. So people with disabilities into consideration, but must say that this is not often the case. And inclusiveness is still too frequently treated as an ethical add-on, something to highlight in reports, but not really embedded into the operational core. In this exercise, it was different because really authorities had to test their actual readiness. They were forced to confront real world barriers, so legal, procedural, logistical, and think really how to coordinate across emergency services, health providers, and civil society actors. And in doing so, in doing so, I think inclusiveness was not just a value, but it became a test of the system. So if we are able to protect and rescue the most vulnerable individuals, our civil protection system is then fit and robust. Therefore, I do see this inclusiveness as a driver for innovation and not just a box to tick in the policies. So let's move to the third core theme that emerged during the GP, which is financing. And if we're honest, this is where things get difficult and political, extremely political as well. Despite years of global commitments, disaster risk reduction remains chronically underfunded. Just 2% of all development assistance currently goes to DRR. Public budgets are stretched, private investment is hesitant, and financial markets have struggled to direct meaningful capital into resilience building. This result is that risk keeps growing, but funding remains stuck. And in some cases, current investment patterns even can make things even worse by driving cycles of increasing debts or decreasing resilience. And this raises serious questions such as who pays for risk reduction, who decides where the money goes, and who ends up more vulnerable in the process. Those questions, I don't believe, were addressed deeply. I mean, they were raised as relevant questions, but they were not addressed or discussed during the sessions. Then throughout the sessions, we also heard a lot about the different innovative financial instruments. These are, yes, promising tools, but very little was also said about the governance of this mechanism. So who controls this, who profits, whose needs are to be prioritized and who's to be ignored. I also perceive that the language of financial innovation can sometimes hide uncomfortable truths about responsibility, sovereignty, and justice. As one participant put it in one of the sessions, we are not against respecting patents, but we can't access the very technologies that are supposed to save our lives. It's money, and that's the issue. So yes, we need financial innovation, but we also need to confront the structural barriers that keep some countries, communities, and groups locked out of this access. And unless we talk about equity and power, we are then reinforcing the very vulnerabilities that we are trying to reduce. And this challenge was made especially clear in a live poll during the high-level dialogue on DRR financing. when asked about the greatest obstacle to scaling DRR investment in their countries, most participants gave a simple, direct answer, which is the political will to make it happen. And this was quite of a straightforward moment to see this result in a room full of participants from all over the world. That said, I also see that there is a strong consensus on one point, that risk-informed investments, which are grounded in science and open to technological innovation, they do make a strong business case. So yeah, the case is there, the tools are here, but what is still missing often is the alignment of priorities, political agendas, and a deeper engagement with the private sector. So these were a bit my perspectives on this aspect. And finally, the last pillar I want to touch on is technology, and probably the one I'm closest to professionally and practically. Let's start with the progress. So as I mentioned earlier, we have seen a rapid expansion of early warning systems. Since 2019, the number of countries reporting multi-hazard early warning system has gone up by 25%, and that's a real achievement. Much of that progress is thanks to technological advancements, things like satellite monitoring, AI-assisted modeling, remote sensing, and digital alert platforms. The Sendai Framework midterm review acknowledged this progress as well, but it also gave a clear warning that access to these tools is still far from equal. Many communities, especially those in low resource setting, are still excluded from the very technologies that could help them the most, actually. And this is not just a funding issue, it's also about digital skills, data access, and whether systems are actually adapted to local context. What struck me at the global platform as well was that technology came up in almost every session, whether the topic was anticipatory action or resilient infrastructures. But there are questions where, again, often left out. For example, what if the algorithm is wrong? What if the sensors fail? So how are the data collected and who owns them? Do first responders actually trust and use these tools in real time? And I believe that these questions really have real world consequences, especially when it comes to data, which is the foundation for most tech-based systems. And at the moment, at the global level, there is still a lack of a standardized digital system to collect data on losses. That makes it really hard to compare or combine risk data across regions and institutions. And what I believe is also even more worrying is that the data behind official indicators aren't always neutral or accurate, so as robust as we would like to think. In some places, casualties numbers are downplayed to avoid public backlash. In other settings, for instance, economic losses might be inflated to attract external support. So there is still a lot of challenges when it comes to collection of data. But again, technology itself is not the problem. The problem lies in how it is used and how it is governed and whether it is trusted. With that said, I did meet some individuals who are deeply engaged into these questions. One is Adam Fish from the UNDRR. He's actually also a very open person and loves engaging in these debates. And people like Adam and others, they are working actively to move the conversation on the nexus between technology and DRR forward. So they don't do this just at the global platform, but they also use other initiatives that look more closely at ethics, accountability. and inclusion in the technological use. And if we want to ground this conversation in real-world practices, I take you to another case study in Switzerland, and I believe you might be more familiar with this one. In many Swiss cantons, investments in early warning and monitoring systems have steadily increased over the years, and technology for monitoring nature is becoming increasingly popular. This is also coupled with direct observations from individuals like hikers, farmers, natural guides, who know the terrain and the local realities very well, and then they report the small changes that they see before they actually become dangerous. So it's a bit a mix of high tech and local eyes on the ground. However, the reality is that our mountains are becoming increasingly unstable due to melting permafrost, glacier retreat, and shifting rock structures. Entire alpine communities are now under threat. And we have reached a point in Switzerland where we are asking ourselves really important questions. So, can we still afford to live in the mountains? And what is our collective willingness to invest in prevention and then also in recovery? On my 28th of May, in the afternoon, this was just a few days before the start of the global platform, actually, approximately 90% of the village of Blatten in the canton of Valais was destroyed by a landslide due to the collapse of the Birch glacier. Residents in the village in Blatten were evacuated a few days prior to the main event, thus preventing a massive loss of life. However, one person has been reported as missing. But the glacier collapse in Blatten is just the latest event. At the same time, other villages in Switzerland, like Brienz or in Kandersteg and others, are really under constant monitoring because the danger in these localities still remains. It has not disappeared, but it's just being watched more closely. And at the global platform, it was very interesting because Blatten was highly debated or discussed during the informal talks. And many international colleagues approached me, and they were really impressed by how swiftly and efficiently the Swiss authorities were able to evacuate the population in Blatten. But this was also, I would say, argue that this efficiency was really the result of careful planning and a well-established monitoring system. Because in Blatten, the glacier was being tracked using 3 complementary technologies. This was made possible through constant collaboration between the authorities that have to make the decisions, the private companies that have developed and offer high-tech monitoring systems, and ultimately the researchers who test and validate these new devices. So these 3 complementary technologies are based on first satellite imagery used to detect broader patterns of movement over time. Then, when significant ships were observed, drones and helicopters were deployed to get a closer view. However, these tools depend on good weather, and in the days before of the collapse, flying conditions were poor, unfortunately. And the third one, and often it's the most expensive tool, is the permanently installation of radar systems, which then provides high precision real-time data on the glacier's movement. So when the critical threshold was reached, this then prompted the authorities to trigger evacuation procedures. And equally important, though, it's to the monitoring. So the monitoring tools is also the continuous risk evaluation with the local population. So when the moment came, people actually knew what to do, and it was not a surprise for them. And I guess if I had to sum up the case study of Blatten, as I did it to my colleagues, the system worked because of heavy investment in technology, which also has or leads to higher cost. But what made the real difference was how the technology was paired with coordination, communication, and public trust to the institutions. So these were my four thematic aspects. I also have a few final thoughts, and maybe this can offer some food for thought or ideas for future projects to those that are listening now. Right now, the UNDRR is working on its strategic framework covering the period 2026 and 2030. But it's really important to remember that, so what kind of organization UNDRR is. It is a coordinating body. It's not an operational one. It does not run field missions or implement technical projects itself, such as other organizations like the UN OCHA. Instead, the UNDRR really depends heavily on partnerships, scientific knowledge, and stakeholder input to move disaster risk reduction forward. This is an aspect that also came through clearly in my conversations with Sendai Framework, which is the chief executive of UNDRR. And one of the big questions we discussed was how can UNDRR build expertise when it has no in-house technical capacity? And again, the answer in part lies in these partnerships with academic institutions, research centers, and practitioners. Initiatives like the recent collaboration that we have at the moment between the ETH Zurich and the UN are actually a good example of this in action. Then with Sandaya, we were openly wondering actually, how do we make DRR attractive? How do we bring young professionals, early career researchers that know and talk data into the disaster risk reduction space? And then, of course, not all targets in the Sendai framework have been met, and maybe some of them were too ambitious to begin with. Was it realistic to expect every country in the world would develop comprehensive local DRR plans? Probably not. And but that does not mean that we have failed. The question we should ask is not what did not work, but I believe it should rather be what have we learned and how can we build on that. And finally, this is something that I have experienced firsthand, and it's an ongoing conversation within my network. How can we do? So, what can we do to help? So, how can we be part of the process, DRR process? And from what I have seen and experienced, the advice probably is still the same: learning how to speak to decision makers. Maybe and don't start the papers with 20 pages on the methodology. I also tend to do this, but probably start with what you want people to take away and actively participate in these collective sessions like the one that we just had. So yeah, thank you so much for this. Those are my details.
Great, thank you so much, Jurgena. That's an amazing and insightful and really concise summary.
Yeah.
Some of the key takeaways from the global platform. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now.
Yeah.